Good evening, Oksiatsigits. I wanted to start off by acknowledging that we are on the Salish, Kootenai, and Pend Oreille homelands. And then I also wanted to make sure and excuse myself as I speak before my elders. So please have pity on me as I share some of what I've learned over the past few years. The research that I'm going to be sharing with you today is my doctoral research, and this has been an interesting journey looking at other natives and their academic journeys in the field of natural resources. I am an enrolled member of the 3 affiliated tribes, and this is a picture of my grandfather. He was actually enrolled on the Fort Peck Indian Reservation, and he served in the military. Prior to going into the military, he was a bobcat. So I'm a Grizz, he's a bobcat. They're both good schools. He actually met my grandmother because he was a soil conservationist. And when he returned from his service in World War II, he became sick. As a result of that, he passed away before I ever got to know him. But part of his legacy lived on in the community of Mandaree, North Dakota. Because he was a soil conservationist, he was the person who decided that we needed more trees. If you're familiar with North Dakota, we are the state that is the least naturally forested state. And so a lot of times with agriculture, they'll want to plant trees to help with the wind. In our community where I grew up, Mandaree, North Dakota, he planted all of the trees in our community. So when I would go to kindergarten and first grade, ride the bus through town, all those trees were trees that my grandfather had planted. And I knew that. That was one of the things that was important. My mother made sure I knew that. Before I left the reservation to come to Montana for graduate school, we had Dutch elm disease, which took out a large number of those trees. But that was part of my foundation of being aware of the land and the natural resources. Also, my people, the Mandan and Hiradza people, are agriculturalists. So I grew up with our traditional life ways of our gardens. We had corn, beans, squash, as well as some melons. Sometimes we would have tobacco, sunflowers. We would also pick various berries, dig turnips, as well as wild onions. So very, very connected to the land. Speaking of the land, there's our beautiful state of Montana, or your beautiful state of Montana, the beautiful state of Montana. And if you think about all of the land that American Indians and Alaska Natives have some kind of jurisdiction or natural resource management over, it would make up the 5th largest state in the United States. So it would be just a little bit smaller than the state of Montana. And if you've had to drive across the state of Montana, it's a pretty big state. So that is a lot of land. Also, if you think about the amount of water that Native people have jurisdiction over, the amount of rivers and streams is more than the length of the Amazon and Nile, or it's 2.5 times the length of the Mississippi River. So that's a lot of water. Indian people are so connected to our land, not only connected because of our cultures, but you look at, that's a big state. That's a lot of land that we can influence the management of the resources. Thinking about diversity within the field of natural resources, why should it matter if Native people or other people of color are in the field of natural resources? Diversity in natural resources, as well as any other field, I guess you could say, is important because you're going to need to be able to address a diversity of different challenges. Also, with Native people, if we are in the workforce of natural resources, we can bring to the table traditional ecological knowledge, that place-based knowledge, those generations upon generations of experience with the land. Right now, there's a significant percent of people in the workforce in the field of natural resources who are over the age of 50 years old. So there's an opportunity for an increase in diversity as well as Native people in our field. Right now, over half of the tribal forestry and fire staff in the Bureau of Indian Affairs is over the age of 50. And about 40% of the Forest Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service are also over the age of 50. So there's going to be a series of retirements occurring. And hopefully, as we graduate more Native people in the different fields of natural resources, they'll be taking over some of those positions, which is important, and especially for tribal natural resource management, because you want the people who are managing the resources to reflect the diversity of the stakeholders. I'm going to share with you my research, which is based on interviews with 30 American Indians, and some of the things I'll share with you are specific stories. So one woman had shared with me a story that I took this picture because I related it to Indians in higher education. She's from a Northwest tribe, and she talked about the importance of salmon to her people. We are salmon people up here. Salmon is essential to our way of life. She talked about how she had worked in the field, the medical field, for a number of years, but was called home to work with her people. And one of her first jobs was working for a dam that had a turbine-friendly dam. They would release the little baby salmon into the water, and very few would make it through to the other side of the dam. And I think about when I read through the statistics for the number of American Indian people who are actually in higher education or who are graduating with their degrees, I thought about those salmon, and I thought about her story. How many of us are actually making it through that dam to the other side? And I'm sure you're aware of we're one of the most underrepresented in STEM fields and are very often the lowest among all racial and ethnic groups for the number of people graduating with their degrees in STEM fields. This is a beautiful piece of ledger art by a Lakota artist, Quentin Maldonado. He resides on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. I like this image to start with thinking about our traditional knowledge systems. They were very much family-oriented, very much in the community. You had your elders. Sometimes it was gender-specific. We had our societies. That was prior to contact. And then there was colonization. There was the impact of treaties on how our children were taught. And some of the things that we've heard today are very heavy topics. And I think about some of those periods. I know there'll be another scholar tomorrow talking about boarding schools, and that's a really heavy topic. So I'll leave that to her tomorrow to give you a deeper talk about the history of education on that side of things. But the part that I'm excited about and that I'm very blessed to be part of is thinking about our tribally controlled schools and our tribal colleges and universities. So there's starting to be that shift. With my research, it's guided by two research paradigms, the Indigenous research methodologies as well as hermeneutics. And they were very complementary. A lot of my data collection was guided by Indigenous research methodologies, and a lot of my analysis was done with hermeneutics. As I mentioned before, I did a qualitative analysis. I had 30 individuals that I sampled, all American Indians who were either pursuing degrees in the field of natural resources or who had completed degrees in the field of natural resources. 16 were female, 14 were male. The average age was 38 and a half. My oldest interviewee was 62, my youngest interviewee, and also my shortest interview. He was 24 years old. And if you've done qualitative work before, the average was about an hour and a half for an interview, and I think his interview was maybe 20 minutes. So that was a very quick interview. Another thing that I think was really exciting about my research of the people that I was able to interview, the highest degree that was earned, 8 of them were bachelor's degrees, 15 were master's degrees, 6 PhDs, 1 Juris Doctorate. So when you're thinking about how very few of us are even in the STEM fields, that's an amazing, to be able to get 15 people with master's degrees, 6 PhDs, and this represents 20 different tribes, tribal affiliations. For my first 30 people, I did in-depth interviews, and then I followed up at the end with 1 talking circle. So I had 3 individuals that participated in a talking circle, similar to what some of our previous presenters. I tried as best as I could went through my university IRB process, but also tried to incorporate appropriate tribal protocols to the way that I would do my interviews, the way that I would engage with my participants. And part of that was the use of tobacco to ask people to participate. And as often as I could, I included food and gifts. Once I had collected all of the data, so I had done all of my interviews, I transcribed all of them, I created an organizing system. My organizing system, I had people who, not just people, but I had those helpers, hardships, lessons, and then visions. So as they were going through their journey, from the very beginning all the way to wherever we were at that point in time, not necessarily the end, they had a number of various experiences, people who had helped them along the way, hardships that they had to somehow either overcome or go around, and things that they had learned about the field as well as higher education. Some of the things that they had experienced were really traumatic, and some people really questioned if it was worth doing. Was what they sacrificed worth it for their education? So together, I had them think about, well, what would an ideal experience look like? What would an ideal degree program be? So that was the visions. Of my interviewees, so I-4, I-19, I-25, for example, those are the individuals. They had a spectrum of experiences. Some of them had very smooth experiences. Some of them had some good, some bad, and then some people had extremely challenging experiences. On the smooth end, a lot of times people were either employed by their tribes while they were students, so through internships or cooperative education agreements. Some of them were employed in the field of natural resources at the time. Some of the next category for a very smooth process was those individuals who had strong support systems. Sometimes this was family, sometimes this was academic supports like an excellent advisor, or it could be student groups like ACEs or SACNAS that really supported them as they were going through their academic experiences. And in the very middle, the intermediate, you see Indian identity. And that was culture, and Indian identity was one of the biggest themes that came out of my research. Sometimes Indian identity acted as something that helped to build resiliency, but then sometimes people had greater conflicts because of their Indian identity. They didn't want to accept additional funding just because they were Native. They didn't want to be put out as an Indian scholar because of the people in their community that would judge them. So there was sometimes conflict and sometimes good things that came from having an Indian identity. On the challenging end of the spectrum, a lot of times those individuals had experienced significant racism, very overt racism, significant trauma like physical assaults, extensive grief. One interesting thing to note about everybody on this spectrum, only one individual, I5, interviewee 5, had attended a tribal college in addition to non-tribal institutions. And almost everybody else who was on the smooth end and some of the people on the intermediate end, that was where you saw tribal colleges. So my thinking is a lot of the experiences that they talked about, the hardships, the good things, having a tribal college as part of their academic experience was where they found the kind of support that they needed to have a good experience. One of the previous presenters talked about idiographic. So in my study, idiographic results are the individual results. So looking at each person's individual experiences, and I had the previous slide that showed who were all the people that had smooth experiences, the intermediate, and then the challenging experiences. And then that was broken down into whether they were employed in the field, employed by their tribe, if they had a good support system. Sometimes people didn't always cue into the field of natural resources right away. So it took them a little bit of extra time as they were pursuing their degrees to find the right fit for them. Sometimes people didn't mature as quickly, so they were still doing things that they just weren't quite ready to be in college yet. I talked a little bit about Indian identity and then lack of preparation. Sometimes that was specifically related to their high school preparation, so their high schools weren't preparing them, and sometimes that was just not being ready to be in college. Interviewee 5, since I had my idiographic results up, this individual, she represented the challenging category. Her very first experiences out of high school were at a tribal institution, and then after earning her bachelor's degree from her tribal college, she decided that she was going to apply for a PhD. She applied to multiple non-tribal institutions, and there was one professor in particular she really wanted to work with. She had done a lot of work with tribal communities. She was non-native, but the work she had done was specifically focused on tribal resources, tribal natural resources. So she had applied to multiple institutions. She applied to her institution where this professor was. The institution interviewed her and, "Are you a Native student?" You know, "Yes, I am Native." "Well, we've had a Native student before, and she didn't do very well. That was part of the response of the institution that she really, really wanted to go to. They said, if we bring you here, we're not going to admit you as a PhD student. All the other institutions had accepted her as a PhD level student. We will accept you, but as a master's level student. Because, that other Native student didn't do so well. So she thought, I'm going to prove them wrong. I'm going to be the Native student who shows them that we are totally capable of earning these degrees. She moved with her son. She was a single mother, and her sister, 3 states away. And it was really hard. Part of why it was hard was because at her tribal college, it was a smaller institution. She got a lot of experience in the lab, learning how to do the different pieces of equipment. But when she got to this non-tribal institution, she was up on the lab end of things. She knew her stuff. But when it came to some of the theory and more technical parts of the coursework, she didn't have the same edge as her non-tribal counterparts. So that was one of the struggles. One of the struggles was her program manager, so the woman who would check her file, make sure she was turning in her reports regarding her progress. I would say, I don't know the exact end of a scale of racism, but she was, would you say overtly racist? So this woman, program advisor, only supposed to collect paperwork, would tell her, you're struggling. I think you need to go to AA. And she didn't drink at all. And she said, and I think your sister needs to go to AA too. Her sister wasn't a student at the institution. So overstepping her boundaries and making some very large assumptions about this young woman. She didn't factor in, she's a single mother. She's multiple states away. She doesn't have other people from her own tribe here at this institution. No, it must be that she's an alcoholic. She did have some positive experiences, but those were primarily at her tribal college. There were other single mothers at her tribal college. There were other people from the same tribe at her tribal college. She was learning about her tribal language, her tribe's use of plants at her tribal college. The things that she was learning at her non-tribal institution were much more abstract and much less applicable to her direct life. So that was one of her struggles, was trying to figure out how to connect what she was learning in the classroom with her tribal people. She did come up against a lot of that racism, and while all of those things were happening, being a single mom, having to deal with this program officer, having to learn a lot more than she, I think, probably anticipated as far as her coursework, her grandmother passed away. 3 states away. Her grandmother passed away. She had been the person, this young woman, the person in the family who knew that it was the expectation that when people in the family passed away, she would be the one to take care of them, to help them to make their journey. As she's going through all of these things at school, she makes the request, I need to return home to take care of my grandmother. She passed. And she had seen accommodations made for other students, and they told her, no, you either stay here and finish, you can't leave for 1 week. So she had to decide, am I going to stay here and finish my coursework, or am I going to go home and take care of my grandmother? She chose to stay and work on her degree. And I'm sure, because of my own experiences, I think my grandmothers that I've lost understood the choices I made. But it was really, really hard for her. And her grades did plummet after that. She had a really bad semester after that happened. The good news is, she did earn her master's degree. I'm so happy for her. All of that stuff she dealt with, she still made it through the dam. She got to the other side. She is now working for a federal agency in the field of natural resources. She doesn't know, at one point she wanted to earn a PhD. Now she's like, that was kind of bad. But, she made it. She did overcome all of those awful experiences to earn her degree. Interviewee 25 is a young man. He had a very super smooth experience. Like if you have children now and you think about what you want their academic experiences to look like, his was so smooth. Once he figured out that he wanted to be in the field of natural resources, it was just like a straight shot for him. His family would take him out into the woods a lot. They would hunt, they would fish. And not only that, but his father was very much, I guess you would say, a cultural leader or a cultural historian for their people. So culture was very much a large influence in his life. After high school, he ended up taking construction jobs. He moved out of town, he worked hard labor, and it got to be to the point where he's thinking, well, this isn't sustainable. And he got a call from his tribe, why don't you come and work for our natural resource department? So he came back, started working for them, and he really enjoyed it. He enjoyed going out into the field. They said, well, maybe you should earn a degree. If you're going to keep working with us, you should have some college. So they said, we will pay for you to earn your degree. He was fortunate that on his reservation they had a tribal college. He was able to be close to home because by that time he had a wife and a child, and he was able to continue working. He really enjoyed the way that his instructors taught. He would go out into the field with his instructors. He would be on his land, learning about his forest, about his plants. Sometimes the language would be right in the classroom curriculum, his tribal language. And then he would go to work on the same land, working with the same trees and the same plants, and he would be able to apply the things that he was learning in class directly to the things he was doing for work. So for him, it was just a very smooth dream experience. No methodic results. So after I looked at each individual interviewee, I put everybody's experiences together, and I was thinking, okay, let's look at their journeys. What themes came out? People, tribal culture, and vision. So what does that mean? People that were very impactful or very influential on their experiences were family, academic people, professionals, community, and then missing. And my sister-in-law gave me a shawl to remember our murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. So I take that with me. Missing, sometimes we have those people, but sometimes we don't. A lot of times, family was really, really a supportive factor at the beginning of people's academic journeys, helping them cue into going to college, cue into the field of natural resources. But as they got further along in their academic journeys, it became those academic people. If they had good staff people, if they had good faculty, if they had good student groups that they were working with, professionals, people who were working in the field of natural resources, community people who would just acknowledge them and encourage them. And then, like I mentioned, the missing people. Sometimes they needed a mentor, but they didn't have a mentor. Sometimes, like with the young lady, interviewee 5, sometimes when we lose someone, there's that hole in our journey. Tribal culture. I think that's where it all starts in all of these stories, is our tribal culture. Our families taking us either out into the garden or out into the woods or out on the prairie to dig those turnips, or to our ceremonies where the first thing we do is we have that water there and we pray with that water. For, in my opinion, the field of natural resources. That's where it starts. And in these academic journeys, our tribal culture, keeping that language and those connections of our land, of our water, of our animals, that importance that is placed upon all of those is what keeps us going. There was one individual who he was raised by his grandparents, and his grandparents would talk about how much of a responsibility he had to take care of the land, because the land took care of him and took care of all of the people. Thinking about our tribal culture, thinking about how our families, our communities take us out into these places, how they show us how to value our water. You know, Mini-Wachoni, water is life. Oh, my little girl loves that. If we're at home and I can be in a totally different room and I say, Mini-Wachoni, she'll say, water is life. But it's those traditional ways that we were taught also. We were shown, we were told, we would practice. Those were the ways we grew up. We grew up fishing, we grew up hunting, we grew up on the land. And when my interviewees would talk about their experiences, when they would talk about the best classes, they were taught in similar ways. They were hands-on, they were experiential. They had instructors who were passionate, who were knowledgeable, and they learned skills and knowledge that was practical, so it was relevant to them. One woman talked about how she went through, she earned her degree, and then she got her first job, and they had never taught her how to read a map. So she goes to her first job and she had no idea how to read a map. So they taught her a lot of the theory, but they didn't teach her some of those practical skills. One woman, interviewee 24, talked about how she was taught and how there was such a complete absence of tribal knowledge, of tribal perspectives, no tribal language in her experiences as a student. And she became a faculty member. So she said, that's what I do now. I make sure my students know that we are part of these sciences. We are part of this land. My students see themselves and their culture valued in my classroom. And that's exciting to me to know that it's part of that shift. It's part of that, whether it's the tribally controlled schools or the TCUs, as we are making it through that dam, we're making the shift. And maybe there won't be a dam someday. Thinking about the vision. What should it look like? What should a ideal degree program structure look like? How would you implement it? Part of that, they talked about the need for having Indian people involved in the development, involved in the visioning. What does that look like? How do you serve them? Because how many times are things made for us, not necessarily by us? So I think that is probably more thinking about non-tribal institutions. Extracurricular activities. So many of my interviewees really, really attributed their success to being involved in student groups. They talked about whether it was ACES, SACNAS, ABLE, that having those groups of other Native students going through the same things as them Even if it was a non-tribal institution, they knew that they had other people that they could talk to who would understand what they were going through. An ideal experience, an ideal degree program would have support systems built in. There would be mentors, there would be formal mentorship, there would be informal mentorship. They would make sure that their students stayed connected to their tribal culture and their tribal lands, whether that meant that there was additional funding to help students to go home to be able to participate in ceremonies, or if that meant having tribal elders brought in as visiting elders and residents. And they would also say that non-tribal institutions need to look at the model of tribal colleges and universities. So, which is, I think, kind of interesting. We're already there. Oops. Sorry, my S. Recommendations. Support diversity. For non-tribal institutions, support diversity. Whether that means having policies and procedures, make sure you have the funding to support a diverse faculty. Make sure that you have diverse staff who are competent, who are compassionate. Support diversity. Make sure that if you are recruiting Native students, you also have things that you're doing specifically to retain them, that it's thoughtful, research-funded retention activities. Native students did better when there were other Native students in their labs. Try to be affordable. So one person had mentioned, what if you had a sliding scale? So everybody had to pay fees, but tuition was a sliding scale. So similar to how some doctor's offices have a sliding scale. Maintain connections for students and communities, making sure that students can get home when they need to. Making sure that you're able to provide emotional support. Interviewee 5, another interviewee, I don't recall the exact number. I had a woman who went through a divorce that she wasn't expecting. I had a woman who was physically assaulted. And what they talked about that helped them was going to counseling, emotional support. Yes, we're going to probably have more traumas than non-Native students. Well, then have things available to help us get through some of those hardships. Space. Make sure that you have space for your Native students. Make sure that they see themselves reflected in that space. Before I left the University of Montana, I was working in the College of Forestry and Conservation. In our building, when you first walk in, you see a giant moose head. Bertha is her name. But now, when you go in and you see Bertha, you also see the word moose in Salish. You see Salish language. You go around the corner and there's a skeleton of a wolf. Wolf in Salish is there. The language is there. On people's emails and on our college website, there is a statement that specifically says our college is on Salish and Kalispel land, and we appreciate and acknowledge that. Our students in the college see the language. They see we value you here. Having a space that's welcoming to Native students. Funding for Native student activities, like I mentioned, student groups was huge. Make sure you support your student groups. Other activities, food is a big deal. Oh my gosh. To be able to eat something besides pizza as a student, it's nice to have some home-cooked food once in a while. Native faculty. So we think about who are the mentors, who are the role models. Sometimes we have some amazing non-Native scholars who really do a wonderful job of supporting Native students. But there's definitely a need for more Native scholars in the field of STEM as well as in the field of natural resources. And it just so happens, tomorrow we'll be talking about the Willow Agate Alliance. So one of our projects is to look at how can we better support Native scholars in the sciences. If you or someone you know is a Native faculty in a STEM field, please come see myself or one of my colleagues, Ka Wu or Lori Walker. Having flexible degree programs. A lot of times students in the field of natural resources would talk about how stringent the programs were. I could only take these courses. I didn't have room for electives. So if there wasn't already Native content in those courses, they couldn't take any NAS classes. If those degree programs were a little more flexible, they would have had those opportunities. On the spectrum that I showed you, on the smooth end, work experience. That was one thing that was really significant too. Thinking about not only what are the practical skills, but let's actually get them out into the field. How can you have students gaining that work experience? So one example would be through internships. Of course, I would highly recommend including tribal knowledge and perspectives in your curriculum. If that's as simple as maybe some tribal names or case studies or potentially traditional ecological knowledge. That's one thing that I think is important. Better college prep and high school. Culturally congruent teaching methods. So talking about how we were taught and what worked well for us. Things that are hands-on, things that are experiential. Having an instructor who's excited, knowledgeable, enthusiastic. And then research opportunities. So being able to actually do research that is going to benefit your tribal community or is with a species that is culturally significant. I'm going to close up here, and I just wanted to acknowledge some of the people and entities that contributed to my research. Hokshi Takapa Mahubakdia, of course my parents, my relatives and family, even those who didn't make it to the end of my academic journey. Friends, colleagues, mentors, my academic family, my committee. I was funded through Sloan, Ford, my college, as well as my university. And Writing Center, for those of you who are working on your degrees, if your university has a Writing Center, make sure and use it. So be courageous. As Indian people, you belong to this land, and I believe that there's a place for all of us in the story of our people. So thank you.